So I have interfaced with our two guests, either via phone in the case of Kathy, and in person with Kate before, in order to write my column and write some articles. So let me introduce you to both of these wonderful master preservers. Kathy has been an extension educator at the UMaine Extension for over 15 years. She provides educational outreach in southern Maine in the areas of home food preservation, food safety, which is super important to canning, as you'll learn, and nutrition education. She also coordinates the Master Food Preserver program in the state of Maine. Kate McCarty has been the food systems professional at the UMaine Cooperative Extension since 2009 after serving in the AmeriCorps Vista program. She's completed the Master Food Preserver program, which is run by Kathy, which is an intensive hands-on training in all aspects of home food preservation. So from, water bath canning, pressure canning, freezing, Kate's got your answers. Kate also manages the efforts of the volunteers for the Master Food Preservers statewide, and she teaches hands-on food preservation programs in southern and western Maine. So without further ado, we're going to hand the mic over to Kathy and Kate, and they're going to kick off this discussion with a little bit of background on canning.
Thanks so much, Sam and Melanie, for the introductions. Kate and I are excited to be here tonight. As you all know, home food preservation is a very exciting topic. We expect that this summer it will also be a very hot and trendy topic as people evolve and adapt to the situation that we're all a part of now with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've certainly seen a heightened interest amongst the folks that we serve here in the southern part of Maine, and we're really excited to be a part of tonight's discussion as well. So to kick us off, I just wanted to talk a little bit about a lot of the different types of methods that are available for home food preservation. And rest assured, like Melanie said, we will be providing links to a lot of this information because it is very technical. Home food preservation is exciting, but the last thing that you want to have happen is to cause anyone to get sick, to cause any harm to anyone with the foods that you preserve. So again, there will be a lot of information available after this webinar. So the first thing that you need to really think about when you are planning to preserve foods at home are what are the methods that I should be using? What's the best approach for the type of food that I want to end up with? We know that we can all think of, a canned green bean truly tastes very different than a frozen green bean. And that has to do a lot with the method and the science behind what's happening to the food as it's being processed. So planning ahead, think about what is it that your family likes. I can certainly say that I have tried a number of recipes that I thought, oh, this looks so good. And, at the end of the year, I still have, 10 of the jars left over because my family simply did not like the product. So plan ahead, consider your family's taste buds. Also, how you plan to serve the product has a lot to do with the steps to the approach that you use to whatever you're going to do to process the product. Consider your long-term storage issues. Are you someone who lives in an area that runs out of power frequently? You have electrical issues with storms and such. Perhaps freezing isn't the best approach for you if you don't have access to a generator, because home freezers usually only last about 24 to 48 hours, depending on how much is in a freezer. So think about all those things before you start into home food preservation. Let's take a minute to talk about some of these most common types of food preservation methods. I mentioned freezing already. In freezing, we are using the temperature of the freezer. Home freezers are usually should be set at 0 degrees Fahrenheit as a means to minimize the microbial growth. So that is the science behind what's happening in a freezer. Freezing, we like to say, is technically safe for any food. However, you're going to want to think about, again, that end result, the texture of, let's say, some foods that are very high in water are not going to end up with a desirable quality from a textural standpoint for you. Think about frozen lettuce. Okay, you could certainly freeze lettuce, but it's not going to give you that product that you actually want to sit down and eat. So again, thinking about that. Freezing can be very quick. Some vegetables do require blanching, which is a step to stop the enzymatic process and help result in a higher quality product. So we say that it is quick, but do remember that some vegetables require blanching. And I also mentioned that, you know, there could be a risk if you're someone who loses power, that you could suddenly be in a situation where you have lost that food supply if you're without power. So plan ahead, think about that. When we talk about home food preservation, the most common method that people think of is canning. You know, we all get that image of a mason jar and a canned good. So what's happening in a canned good is that you are applying heat to the product that's inside of a jar. And what's happening through the application of heat is that ultimately you will have a vacuum seal form, which then makes that product shelf stable. And according to the USDA, it remains shelf stable for up to 1 year. But the heat process that's applied is destroying microorganisms, things such as mold, yeast, and bacteria. And it also is inactivating the enzymes. So it's stopping that product from deteriorating. You have the vacuum seal, which is preventing any recontamination from occurring. So you end up with a shelf-stable product. In terms of canning, there are 3 different types of methods that I just want to quickly go over. The boiling water bath is simply a pot that is large enough to have up to 1 to 2 inches of water over the top of those jars, and another 1 to 2 inches of room for the boiling water, because you don't want to have the boiling water splash out of the pot. So the heat of the boiling water is transferred into the jars, and that is the process that is adequate to destroy the molds, the yeast, and some of the bacteria. So what we love about the boiling water bath is that it is an inexpensive piece of equipment. Again, it's a large pot with a rack in the bottom. Some of the things that you need to think about are that a boiling water bath can only be used for foods that are called high acid foods. So we tend to cluster fruits, pickles, relishes, salsa. Those are the foods that are our high acid foods. And I'm, making sure you're following a recipe that's been tested to make sure it's high enough in acid for those relishes and salsas. So those are the things that you can only use it for that. If you are looking to can something like a meat product, that has to be processed in a pressure canner. So again, boiling water bath relies on boiling water to create a hot processing to make that food safe. Recently, another method has been approved for canning high acid foods, and it is the atmospheric steam canner. Research was conducted from some of our colleagues at the University of Wisconsin, and in the atmospheric steam canner, steam is simply the source of heat that now, instead of the boiling water in a boiling water bath, is going to apply heat to process those foods safely. So what people like about the atmospheric steam canner is that because it relies on a smaller amount of water, it uses less energy and less heat is produced in your kitchen. Some things that you need to be aware of for an atmospheric steam canner is because there's a smaller amount of water in it, you can only process foods that require less than 45 minutes in it. So that takes us then to the third method, which is the pressure canner. So what happens in a pressure canner is you have a combination of heat in a sealed container that builds steam. So steam under pressure reaches a much higher temperature than just plain steam or boiling water. The difference, it gets up to 240 degrees or hotter. And that is significant when we talk about those low acid foods that you may want to can, such as meat, such as, regular vegetables, let's say potatoes or peas, something like that. Because the temperature that's reached under pressure is high enough to kill those bacterial spores that can be found in low acid foods that cause people to suffer from botulism, which can be a deadly issue. There have been a number of recent outbreaks involving home canned foods. So we definitely want to, make people aware that those low acid foods, it's not an option. They are required to be canned in a pressure canner. So again, it's the only method for canning shelf-stable low acid foods like vegetables or meat. Some cons around pressure canning is that it can be an expensive appliance and the processing times tend to be longer. So those are some things to be aware of. There are plenty of other type methods for food preservation. Dehydrating and fermenting are two of the others. They truly result in a unique product, so a dehydrated food like a meat, beef jerky or a fruit leather, something like that. Very unique product. A lot of people like those things to have on hand for hiking and camping because it's very lightweight and they are shelf stable. But again, not everyone may love those dehydrated foods, and it does require purchasing an electric dehydrator. Here in Maine, we do not advocate for solar drying because we don't tend to have many lovely low humidity, high temperature days like you may find in a state such as Arizona. Fermenting, just a quick overview, is a very popular topic these days. Sauerkraut, fermented pickles, kimchi, kombucha. Those are certainly really hot topics right now. And they do create very unique flavors. But some of the things you need to be aware of is that it is a trickier skill to master. And you do need to be able to tightly control your temperatures that you're fermenting foods in. If you have an environment where the temperature fluctuates a lot, you may have some difficulty fermenting foods that are of high quality. And many things can go wrong to spoil your product, so you want to make sure and be following the latest information on that to keep it safe. And fermenting relies on creating lactic acid, which again is that control. I talked about in the canner, we have the heat as the control. I talked about in the freezer, we have, again, the temperature of the cold temperature as the control. So everything has a control, and in the form of fermenting, it's the lactic acid that's formed as a result of being in a perfect climate to let that happen. So that's just a general overview. I'm gonna toss it back to Kate to talk about some bullet points for some updates because, things are always changing.
Great, thanks, Kathy. So yes, there's a number of updates. Some are relatively recent, some are have been around for a while, but maybe if you learn from somebody who learned how to can before that, you might not have had this passed down to you. So some of this comes from other extensions or USDA doing research around the process, and some is just from like the manufacturer of the product. So the first update is an example of a manufacturer's update. So Ball is a big name, obviously in home canning, making a lot of, making the jars and a lot of other equipment. And they've done a number of updates to their lids. So the jars or the lids that go on the canning jars have a food grade plastic lining on the inside to protect the metal from your acidic foods. And largely in response to consumer demand, they're now making this plasticine liner BPA free. So if that's important to you, look for the BPA free on the box of lids. So any new lid that you find from Ball on the shelves today is going to be marked as BPA free. And then along with that change, they have done more research around preparing the lids for applying to your jars and canning. So they used to recommend, Ball used to recommend that you simmer these little lids in a pot of water. And then when you would apply them to the canning jars, you would use this magnetic lid lifter to get one out at a time to put on your jars. But they have done more updates and found that, more research, and found that they don't require heating anymore. So you can continue to do this if it's ingrained in you and you can't imagine skipping it. It doesn't hurt anything, but if you're more like me and you always forgot to do it until the very last minute, you can skip it. So you just give these a wash in hot soapy water and then put them on your jars when you're filling the jars. This is one, the next update is one that's not all that new, but comes as a surprise to many people I speak to in my canning classes. You need to add some sort of acid to your home canned tomatoes. So as they've done more research around the acidity of tomatoes, they found that a lot of them hover around that high acid, low acid cutoff, so a pH of above or below 4.6. So as we pursue these heirloom varieties in the US, a sweeter tomato, they actually are less acidic, they don't just taste it. And so for the purposes of home canning, all of the recipes that are developed now require the addition of acidity, either in the form of a bottled lemon juice or citric acid, which they sell for home canning. So you can find this jar of it, or you could find it for cheese making supplies. We'll have to send you the recommendations for that in follow-up so that you have it written. It's a very small amount per jar, and I'm someone who's kind of a summer tomato purist, so I completely understand why people might be resistant around the fear of it impacting the flavor, but it's a really small amount per jar, and it is required for safety. You can also add vinegar, but you have to add vinegar to the point where it will start to affect the flavor. So we recommend either the bottled lemon juice or citric acid. So for jamming and jellying, there's now a variety of low sugar pectins that are available. So pectin is the substance that you add to help your jam or jelly set, so to make it gel. And you can add a commercial one to ensure that it sets. You can cook fruit and sugar together and it will gel on its own, but you have to use a lot of sugar. So if perhaps you learned from someone in your family who's more of a traditional jam maker, you might find that they have a lot of added sugar. So as people look to reduce sugar in their diet, they turn to these no sugar needed or low sugar pectins. So there's a variety out there. These are just two examples of some that I found kicking around in the office. The no sugar needed means that you can use an alternative sweetener like Splenda, but you could also use honey, maple syrup, fruit juice, agave, on and on and on with some pectins, because it's the sweetener is just there for flavor, not related to the chemical set of the product. So it's kind of nice to be able to divorce those two things and just have the sweetener there for flavor. And then Kathy mentioned that steam canning is now an approved method. So that's a more recent update. So you might encounter language in some publications that say that steam canning is not recommended, but that just needs to be updated because it is approved now. But something that's very tempting, but however not recommended, is the electric programmable pressure cooker, or the brand name, one of the brand names is an Instant Pot. Several of those manufacturers recommend canning in them, and they are not recommended for canning. The manufacturers have done the research, but not provided it to the public, and so no one is able to independently verify it. And we've actually had extension colleagues who have done their own research and found that they don't get hot enough for long enough to safely preserve your low acid foods. So when it comes to the fear of botulism in home canning, we really recommend that you choose an approved method, and those electric programmable pressure cookers are just not there. Other methods that are no longer recommended is the open kettle method. So this is where you heat your product, say pickles or tomato sauce or jam, you sterilize your jars, you pour the hot product into the hot jars, you screw the lids on, and you call it a day. So no actual canning involved. This is an older process that maybe was recommended, but now is no longer, without that added heat processing, it doesn't adequately destroy those molds, yeast, and some bacteria. And then you don't get a strong vacuum seal. So as the product cools, it might cause the little button in the lid to pop in, but that's not a strong vacuum seal that's created during the canning process. And then a subset of that is the inversion method, where you put jam or jelly in jars, screw the lids on, and then actually flip the whole thing upside down and let it cool. Again, this was recommended, but they have found with more research that it doesn't adequately destroy the bacteria that might be in there. And then processing in your oven is not recommended. This could give your jars a high risk of breaking, and it's a different type of heat in the oven, so it doesn't adequately heat the product in the jar evenly. And the jars are not actually designed to withstand oven temperatures, so you run the risk of jars breaking, and it can be dangerous. And then a lot of appliance canning is not recommended, so nothing in your microwave, a slow cooker, a crock pot, again, those small electric pressure cookers, or using the sun. And these methods can be dangerous, result in an unsafe product, and aren't recommended. And then any sort of canning powders or chemicals that are looking to replace the heat processing aren't recommended either. All right, so that, Kathy and I were calling that the naughty list. So that's our rundown of the naughty list. And I think with that, we're ready to open it up for questions.
Awesome. Well, I gotta say, I was very pleased to hear that I don't have to heat my lids anymore, because I do that. And like you, I wait until the very last minute and then I remember I have to do it. Deb wanted to know, should those lids be thrown out after one use?
So lids are recommended for one-time use only. And that is due to the fact that the sealing compound that's underneath becomes really smushed during the storage of your jars. So you've got that nice, strong, tight vacuum holding the lid onto the jars. And then when you open them, you know, you'll use the church key side of your can opener and damage the lid. So then if you were to try and use it again, it just might not seal. So the one-time use only is recommended for like the highest seal rate. If you do in a pinch have to use a lid again and it seals, it's fine. They just say that for the highest seal rate, just use them once. And you saw I was holding up this little box. They sell them next to canning jars, grocery stores, hardware stores, big box stores. You can buy these little replacement packs for $2 to $3.
So our guest Jeanette wasn't really quite sure what the boiling water bath actually does when you're canning. Is it disinfecting the jar, disinfecting the contents? What is the process of a boiling water bath canner?
Thanks, Sam. So in a boiling water bath, you've got the hot water, so the boiling water. Here in Maine, we're at sea level, most of us, so that's 212 degrees. So through the transfer of that heat into the jar, you are using heat as the means to kill any molds, yeast, and most bacteria that can be present. So it's really the control mechanism for creating a safe product. The heat from the boiling water is also what helps to create that vacuum seal, because it heats up the food, and then in the cooling process, the vacuum seal forms. And that, to most home canners, is the true sound of satisfaction and success when you hear the ping. So that's what's happening. Whole lot of heat movement.
Absolutely. Michael wants to know if there are any typical recipes that include meat that people preserve.
So the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning is the book that we would encourage people to use, and I have that book here. I can hold it up for you all to see. This has a whole section on canning meats. So it includes poultry. The meat section is specific for, it includes game. So there are recipes in here that include just regular canned meat, but they also do a chili. They also, so they offer a variety of types of meat recipes in there. But that is the book that I would recommend as the go-to for home canning of meats. And I can, take a look in give you a little snapshot if you wish. So again, the contents in there do include strips, cubes, or chunks of meat, which you could then turn around and use in a different type of recipe that you're preparing. So again, follow these recipes. They all do, as mentioned before, in pressure canning, have a very long processing time that must be followed.
Let's talk a little bit about headspace. Our guest Jeanette also wanted to know why you have to leave that gap between the contents and the top of the jar.
So headspace is the amount of space that you leave between the top of the jar and your food. So basically it's how full you fill your jar. So you don't just fill it all the way up to the top and put the lids on and put it in the canner. What this space does is it allows for the food to expand during the canning process and that air to be driven out of the jar. So it helps facilitate the vacuum seal that forms when the food heats up inside the jar, the air is driven out, and then you take the jars out of the canner and let them cool fully. That vacuum seal forms. There's no air inside the jar. So different products have different headspace, and that's based on their density and how much they're going to expand. So for jams and jellies, it's only 1/4 of an inch because they're thicker and they don't expand much. For other high acid products, so tomato products, salsas, pickles, relishes, chutneys, it's 1/2 inch. And then for pressure canning, it's a full inch. So it is really important to get right to make sure that your product doesn't overflow. So if you overfill your jars, it's going to expand, gunk up the rim, seep out of the jar, and then potentially prevent a seal from forming. And then if you leave too much space, so if you get to that last jar in the batch, and you can't meet the minimum headspace, you might be tempted to say, it's close enough, I'll just can it anyway. What potentially will happen is that you'll have oxygen left inside the jar, which then could fuel microbial growth that would spoil your food. So they make a headspace measuring tool to help you measure out, because like I said, it's just fractions of an inch, from a 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 inch. So this tool, you rest on the rim of the jar, and then where it pokes down into the jar should be level with the top of your food. These tools you can find in a canning kit from Ball, and sometimes you'll find them sold separately. We have 1 million of them, so if you are going to be filling out Melanie's evaluation, maybe we could work together to hook you up with one through the mail. Because it is so important to get it right to ensure that safety of your canned product. A lot of people are tempted to just eyeball it with the threads, but that's not recommended. So this tool is pretty essential.
I appreciate the use of visual elements. It's nice.
If you want to see, just as a side note, if you want to see Kate showing me how to use that tool, you can watch my Sam Tries Things video.
Yes. You know, tools are so effective and important. Something that you haven't talked about with creating jams is a freezer jam. What's the difference between doing a hot water bath of a jam or a freezer jam?
So a hot water bath process for a jam just allows you to keep it at room temperature. So you create a shelf-stable product, whereas a freezer jam requires the temperature control from your freezer. They're both great options. The freezer jam, so I still remember the first time that I had freezer jam because it was that vivid of a flavor experience. It was a strawberry freezer jam, and I was so impressed at how fresh the flavor tasted. So you can find a pectin that you can use to make freezer jam that is uncooked. And so it really maintains that fresh fruit flavor. And then you just pop it in a freezer grade container and put it in your freezer. So it's really easy, great for a summer day, great to do with kids because it doesn't involve cooking. So I absolutely love it. You can also follow a recipe for canning, for making jam for canning, but put it in the freezer instead. So if you get to the end of the process and you say, I just can't do it with the boiling water on a hot summer day, you could always opt to freeze it instead. Or just intentionally start that way from the beginning and just freeze your jam instead of canning it.
If you do wind up canning, should you keep the rings on the jar or should you take them off after you have finished canning?
This is a surprise to a lot of people, even our more experienced canners. Kate already reviewed that the metallic lid is a single use only. The screw bands can be reused multiple times as long as they're rust free. But when you do go to store your jars, you do remove the ring, because remember, you've made it shelf stable through the canning process. So you have a vacuum seal, so it is sealed. And the screw band, you know, can trap moisture and create rust. But also you want to, once your jars are out of the canner and you know that you've gotten a seal, you've waited 24 hours, you've looked to see that the seal is intact, you want to wash your jars off and then store them. And when you wash those jars off, simply remove the screw band, wash under there, and then store in a cool 50 to 70 degrees, dark, dry place. And that will help with your quality for a long-term storage product.
What if you don't get that seal? What if after 24 hours you've waited and maybe some of your jars have sealed and some of them haven't? Can you save those jars?
Well, you can pop them in the refrigerator and you can use them within the recommended 2 weeks of time for using a canned product. You could go through the process of reprocessing, but if you've just got 1 or 2 jars, for me, that really doesn't make a lot of sense to break out all the pots and pans and heat everything back up again. I just prefer to put it in the refrigerator and use it quickly. Or oftentimes I'll have happy neighbors because if I have more than 1 jar, I'll give it to them and say, use it within 2 weeks. So that's a great way to use up the volume too. But you can reprocess, and there will be information on that in the resources that we share.
Lori wants to know if you are canning vegetable soups or baked beans, do you need to process them with a pressure canner, or is that something that you could get the acid off enough to do a water bath can?
Those are both great things to process in your pressure canner. So they are both low acid foods, and they both require pressure canning. They are not foods that are high acid, nor would you really want to change them to make them high acid, because that's not what they are. So vegetable soups you can. You just don't want to add any rice or pasta, any of those starchy foods. Save that for after, when you go to use the product. So when you can vegetable soups or stocks, it's just straight up vegetables with some flavoring and broth. And baked beans, there are recipes for how to process baked beans in a pressure canner. Some of those are in the tomato sauce, which may not be a traditional Maine food, but there's also a recipe for beans and molasses sauce, which would be more of our traditional Maine food.
A couple of our readers emailed us before this event, Nicole and Pat. It sounds like they have a lot of rhubarb, and they would like to know the best way to freeze their rhubarb to save it for later.
Speaking of traditional Maine foods.
So rhubarb is super simple to freeze. It is one of those foods that does not need to be blanched before it's frozen. So you can simply harvest your rhubarb, discard the leaves because they're poisonous and not meant to be consumed. Wash it well, trim off any unwanted bits, that are from the plant or the garden, and then chop it up into whatever size you plan to use it in. So again, like Kathy was saying at the beginning, think about the end product. So if you're going to be dicing it and using it in quick breads or muffins or scones, you want to use a smaller cut. But if you are going to cook it into a sauce, so I love to freeze rhubarb this time of year and then use it in other fruit jams throughout the season. And so you can cut it into like inch pieces because it breaks down really quickly when heated. And so it's nice to be able to cut it in bigger pieces to make the task go faster. So chop it all up and then simply package it into a freezer grade plastic, either flexible or a flexible bag or a rigid sided container, something that's meant for the freezer to help keep out unwanted odors and ice crystals. Get all the air out as best you can, and then pop it in the freezer, and then try and use it within 8 months for best quality. Super simple, very satisfying.
And I've heard there's quite a bumper crop of rhubarb this year, so people can take advantage of that. I think one of my favorite things to have is in the middle of January. Nothing tastes as good as a strawberry rhubarb pie using both frozen Maine strawberries and rhubarb. So one of the things I enjoy.
I like to make those for Thanksgiving and bring, and it makes everybody happy because they're not expecting it, right?
Yeah.
Sam, do you have a question that you want to ask?
Yeah, so I have a few questions. Just a reminder to everybody that you can put your questions in the chat, though we will open it up again at the end for people to contribute, via the call. But a question that I get a lot from my readers is that, my grandma has this recipe and I've been, she used to make it when I was a kid and it's delicious, but I've heard that it's not safe to use grandma's recipes anymore. So why is that? And is there anything that can be done to save an old canning recipe? Any adjustments that could be made?
So we get that question a lot. Absolutely true. A lot, canning is something that's passed down through families typically. So the advice that we give to folks is to look at that recipe and try to match it up to one of the tested recipes, like for example, that come from the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning or the So Easy to Preserve book. Those are all tested recipes. So if you can find something comparable to that, that would be one that has that correct ratio of a volume of, for example, I think I get this question most frequently with relishes. So it would have a correct ratio of vegetables to acid. And the acid that's typically in a relish is a vinegar, which we recommend all vinegars that are used in home canning have a 5% acidity written on the label. So that is a starting point for you to say, okay, if this is grandma's famous green tomato relish recipe, can I find something in here? And then look to see what are the ways that the recipes differ. We're happy to talk that through with people over the phone. If it's simply a case of, grandma had a secret spice that she used, that's perfectly safe to use. But what you want to have are the volume of vegetables in a correct ratio or proportion to the acid, so that you know that it is a safe product from a pH standpoint to process in a boiling water bath. And it's those combination foods that we tend to have the most question or concern about.
I'll be sure to share the titles of those two books with everybody in the email afterwards so that you can find them and use them yourself. Deb had a question about how to rescue and preserve the stuff she bought that's about to go bad. She says her worst offense is buying fresh herbs, but also hot and bell peppers, bananas, melon, and more. Do you have any tips for Deb?
I say open your freezer door and put them in there. That's really the quickest, safest, and easiest way to freeze foods. And, I just want to say kudos to you for looking out for those foods, being mindful of when you need to use them by, and then simply staying a step ahead of that. But I too find myself in a situation if I have to buy fresh herbs off, it may be a larger volume than what I can use, that I need to use. And then they tend to find themselves in the back of the produce drawer and then they're slimy. So if you can use them within those recommended window of time for a fresh herb would be, within a week, you can freeze those. You could also dehydrate them in your microwave. That is an easy way to store them in a dried form. And peppers could get you can chop them up however you're going to use them. and put them in the freezer. They are one of the vegetables that do not require blanching ahead of time. So peppers, tomatoes, and onions, none of those require blanching ahead of time. But that's a easy way. That's the advice I would give her.
Jeanette had a question about using agar instead of pectin for jams.
No, I have never used that in jamming. If she wants to weigh in more about why she's looking to use an alternative gelling agent, we could maybe elaborate. So the only thing I've seen, there's a traditional no pectin added where you just boil typically equal parts fruit and sugar and rely on the natural pectin in the fruit for the jam to gel. And then there's the added pectins, which give you that certainty that your jam is going to set. And then we have seen there are some recipes in So Easy to Preserve using gelatin to gel your jams or jellies. Those seem more traditional recipes to me. We don't get a lot of requests for those, but
Jeanette added that she's interested in learning more about agar because she has to eat foods that are high in omega-3 fatty acids. May I recommend smoked fish?
You could always safely experiment and use freezer jam, so that wouldn't run afoul of any sort of canning principles where you have to worry more about food safety. Try your freezer with the alternative gelling.
Sure.
And let us know. Report back.
Yeah, absolutely. Carol and John want to know, can you use either white vinegar or apple cider vinegar if they're both 5% acidity? Does it matter?
Yeah, so all preserving recipes that call for added vinegar, the 5% is the big thing. Any other type of vinegar you can sub in is fine. So it will affect the flavor, of course, which you might find desirable. So if you wanted a sweeter profile, then the more harsh white vinegar, you can safely substitute in any kind of flavored vinegar you want, as long as it's 5% acidity.
Marty added a good little chat about herbs. He freezes his parsley and then it's always available. Another thing you can do is use, put your herbs and some melted butter or oil and put them in ice cube trays, and then you can use them later if you are gonna lose those herbs. Trust me, I do it all the time. It's frustrating to lose your fresh herbs. But what I think I'm going to do, because it's, we've got about 10 minutes left, I am going to give everybody the ability to unmute yourself, to ask your own question of either Kathy or Kate or Sam, or a comment or a tip that you have found in your home canning to share with people. The only thing that I ask of you to do, please, is if you're not speaking, just keep yourself muted. There's a little button down in the left-hand corner of your screen that says mute. And if you click it, you'll not be muted. And if you click it again, you'll mute yourself. So I'm going to give you all the ability to unmute yourself and to ask some questions or share some comments. So is there anybody that wants to share something in the group? Marty, you kind of look like you shrugged, like you wanted to share something. And if you need help unmuting, you can just wave your arms and I can help you. Oh, Dennis, I see you. Go ahead, Dennis.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What I was going back to the rhubarb, the one other thing that I do is I kind of pre-plan what I'm planning to do with it, whether I'm canning it as a chutney or baking it as a bread or a crisp. And when I freeze it, I weigh it as I package it. Otherwise, it kind of turns into a giant ice cube. So I bag it up proportionately. And then I mark it as such. When I take it out, I know I have the right amount for that particular type of recipe.
That's a really good idea. I do that, Dennis. What I do with my rhubarb and blueberries is I lay them out on a cookie sheet with sides.
Yeah.
And I freeze them that way so that they don't all get bunched together, because no one wants to make blueberry pancakes with a handful of blueberries.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Is there anyone else that would like to share a comment? You can raise your hand. Kate said that she's getting a message that people cannot unmute themselves. Let's figure that participants to unmute themselves. I can try to, I'm gonna unmute everybody. Let's see what happens. So if you're not speaking, please hit that mute button, especially if you have a dog or someone crying in the background. Here we go. How'd that go? Some of you are still muted, some of you aren't. Who would like to share something? Elizabeth. Hold on, Elizabeth, I'm gonna unmute you. Oh, Elizabeth, hold on, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, hold on. She's speaking and I can't unmute her, strangely.
Maybe she needs to unmute herself.
Yeah. Elizabeth, I'm so sorry we can't hear you. I'm trying to unmute you on my end and I can't do it for some strange reason. I apologize. Would you like to send in your question via the chat and I can ask it for you? Anybody else that has not having muting issues, or you can wave your hand and I can give a shot, I can give a try.
I had a question about using the pressure cooker. I have a brand new one that I've had for 10 years and I have not used it because I'm afraid of it. When I was a child, I watched my mother prematurely open the pressure cooker. And it's an image I'll never forget. Any recommendations?
I know, I'm seeing you. I don't know why I can't, oh, there's a lag. Here we go. Kate,
Okay.
go ahead.
Thank you.
So Kate, did you want to answer that or you want me to?
Go ahead. I was so focused on the muting issue that I wasn't, I don't remember the question.
Right. The elements
pressure canning.
Right, pressure canning. So what I would add is that today's pressure canners have additional safety features that were perhaps not part of the pressure canners of the 40s, 50s, 60s, some of which I still see are around in folks' kitchens. So two elements of today's pressure canners are an overpressure plug, which if you are building up too much pressure, it will release itself through a teeny tiny plug in the top of the lid. And the other feature, which would is a built-in locking mechanism that will not release until the pressure canner has reduced the pressure volume in the can itself. So you literally cannot take that lid off prematurely. So, you know, using a pressure canner of today, someone wouldn't have to witness what you, sounds like you witnessed, which was the early removal of a pressure canner lid, which would be under pressure and would cause it to, you know, kind of blow off.
My friend Elizabeth, I see that you are no longer muted. Let's hear from you.
Hi, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Good, okay. I learned from experience you have to peel a banana before you freeze it. Trying to peel a banana while it's still frozen doesn't work. But I do that as my bananas are getting beyond ripe. I chop them up into proportions, freeze them in a little freezer bag, and then use them to make smoothies with other fruit. And great way to use frozen bananas.
I agree, Elizabeth.
I applaud your thriftiness. It's right. I'm of the same vein.
Speaking of thriftiness, I get a lot of questions about people who are shopping for pressure canners at the thrift store. Kathy made a face.
No, I didn't.
If you are looking for a pressure canner at the thrift store, you find one at the thrift store, what are some things you should look out for to make sure it's still viable and safe to use?
That is a great outlet to find some good buys. I will point out that your local UMaine Extension office does offer a free testing service if the pressure canner that you buy has a dial gauge. We can test to see if that's still accurate and make a recommendation on whether or not it needs to be replaced or not. We can also look it over to make sure that it does have a viable gasket on it, that it's still pliable, it's not something that's dry and cracking, and we can just give it an overall look. And those are some of the things that you should be looking for as well. I would say that, if it looks like it's something that you would have found in, your grandmother or your great-grandmother's pantry, that you may be better off purchasing a newer one. They cost about $100, $125. So I would encourage you to get the newer model because they do have those built-in safety features. A couple of the names that we're very familiar with and we see a lot of and have experience with are Presto, Miro, and then the All-American are some of the more common, more reputable types of pressure canners.
Great question. It is almost 6 o'clock, and I wanted to let Kathy and Kate talk a little bit about the online series that they're doing about food preservation at UMaine, and I will absolutely include a link to what they're talking about in the follow-up email.
Sure. I'll kick it off. We're having a lot of fun this summer, meeting the new demands for home food preservation education via our webinar series, which are happening weekly, Tuesdays at 2. And we are having topics that coincide with the Maine growing season. So for example, this past week, we covered freezing rhubarb and freezing greens. Next week, we will do an introduction to the boiling water bath as a canning method. And then we have a whole lineup of topics that are coming up. So I'll let Kate add to that as far as how you can register and any other fun information.
Melanie's going to help us out by sending you the link directly to your inbox. So you can sign up for any of the topics that interest you throughout, again, weekly throughout the growing season. So through the end of October, we'll be presenting Tuesdays at 2. And if you can't make it live, we understand that is during the workday. So you can register anyway, and then we'll follow up with the resources and how to access the recorded link. They're 45 minutes long, so nice and accessible, we think. Fun little bite size. And like Kathy said, we're having a lot of fun.
That's really great. Man, technology is really helping us out here, isn't it? I wanted to thank you guys all for coming tonight. We have a full lineup for June for BDN events online. We're going to be having some author and poet events. We're going to be having some songwriting events, as well as practical meetings about marketing and about the election and with some nonprofits. So I hope to see a lot of your faces at our upcoming events. I'll be sure to send out an email to everybody. And I just wanted to thank Sam and Kate and Kathy for joining me tonight. It's, it really is starting to feel like summer in Maine. My lilacs are out, the lily of the valley are out, my rhubarb is bursting. So thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you again later this month. Thank you.
Bye everyone, thanks for coming.
Good night.
Thank you.